Here's a list of the 3 all-decade teams. The first team, Steph Curry, James Harden, LeBron James, Kevin Durant, Kawhi Leonard. Hard to argue there. Now we go on to the second team. Chris Paul, Russell Westbrook, Anthony Davis, Blake Griffin, and Carmelo Anthony. And then the third team, D. Wade, Kobe, Paul George, Lamarcus Aldridge, and Giannis. So Malika, which players selected were you most surprised by?
Well, I find it interesting that Lamarcus Aldridge is here in a Blazers jersey in that graphic. And Lamarcus Aldridge was a little bit surprising for me. And that's because his game's never been all that sexy, right? I mean, he was in Portland, he was an anchor there, and he had a lot of hype around whether or not he was going to re-sign with the Blazers. And then he went down to San Antonio. And since then, it's sort of been like he hasn't been this big name main attraction. So for me, when I saw that he was ranked 6th in total points scored, that was a little bit surprising to me. I forgot about that. So with a list that's hard to make, it was him for me that I said, huh.
Yeah, I mean, look, it was about buckets basically for Lamarcus. Jonathan, where were your thoughts? Who was the biggest surprise, I guess, for you?
Carmelo Anthony, I think, on the second team. I think that's a little bit questionable. We're going to get into some of the guys that maybe should have been ahead of him. But, the fact that Carmelo Anthony is sitting at home right now, there's not a team in the NBA that wants him. It's 2019. We're still in this decade. That, to me, has to count for something when you look at some of the names that were not on this second team. And Blake Griffin a little bit, too, but Melo is the main one for me. Yeah,
I thought Melo was probably a bit too high. And again, we'll kind of get into the specifics here in a bit. But Lamarcus Aldridge was the one because, again, you mentioned not a sexy game in Portland, and then basically less sexy, I guess, in San Antonio in a lot of ways. So, yeah, I think that there's some guys that probably could have been left off. You can make the case that some guys could have been a little higher in some cases, which we'll do shortly. I could make the case, if it's just based on championships, too, maybe Dwyane Wade should be higher than the third team, considering his impact. And by the way, he walked away last year at 37 years old, still being a very good player in this league. So there's a lot of different ways, I guess, we can go with this. But let's turn our attention to the guys who were left off the list. I think one of the biggest omissions from this list was Klay Thompson, a 2-time All-NBA guy, obviously 3 championships. Malika, what do you make of Klay being left off the list?
He is one that I listed as a little bit surprising to not see on there too. But for me, when I'm thinking about championships combined with just consistency, Klay has been such a consistent contributor to the Golden State Warriors as they have become one of the most dominant teams in sports. So that was surprising for me. And then the 2 others I had were Kyrie and actually Dirk. Because just the continued excellence there for both of them was just a little bit surprising to see, Carmelo make that list and not those 2.
Yeah, Dirk Nowitzki is the greatest international basketball player of all time. There's no question that he needed to be here on this list, ahead of Lamarcus Aldridge, ahead of Blake Griffin, ahead of Carmelo Anthony. I also think that Kevin Garnett is a guy that we could be talking about here. Steve Nash. I know that is kind of the end of their career, the early 2010s section there, but Steve Nash was still All-NBA in 2010, All-Star in 2012, led the NBA in assists in 2011. Steve Nash deserves to be on here too.
Yeah, I mean, the Nash thing, I think it's because, again, it was early in the decade, right? Like, you can make the argument against it, even though I'd be with you, right? Like, I'm not arguing against you. The Dirk stuff is fascinating to me because he won a championship, obviously, in that scenario. He still averaged, up until 2 seasons ago, about 18 points a game or more in the decade. So there's certainly room for him to be on there. And in that championship, he might have had arguably the biggest upset we've had in NBA Finals history, or at least in that conversation.
And you add, 2011 Finals MVP to that list. He was a 5-time All-Star. He averaged 20.8 points and 6.7 rebounds per game in 7 seasons of that decade. And so when we're talking about this, I realize this might sound silly, but 10 years is a long time. And so if you split that decade into 2, all right, first 5 years, second 5 years, you end up coming up with a lot more names of who could be on that list. But for the guys on the first team, what they all have in common, Steph, LeBron, those types of guys, is they've been dominant for a very long time. And so it's hard for 10 years to be able to consistently keep that level of play. And these guys are just in a league of their own.
Let me ask you about Giannis on the third team. Is there enough of a body of work to put Giannis on this list already?
Well, here's the thing. Yes, I think there is. But the reason that there he is up on the screen making the third team is because his breakout has really been over the last 2 seasons. He's become a player that we've said, wow, that is a unique skill set. His body has kind of caught up with his length. He's filled out. He's had his basketball IQ has increased, and he is an intensely committed worker. That being said, I think he's only going to move up on this list, and he's going to be one of those players that we could see in the All-Star game for the next 5-10 years. And so I think he will eventually make his way up to that first team.
Yeah, Giannis is going to be in that first team when we look at the next decade,
right,
clearly. And so, I mean, he's so young. He's just, really kind of emerged in the last 2-3 years as, one of the top 5-10 NBA players in the NBA. And so I see the argument for him being third team. I would not put him behind, Blake Griffin, Carmelo Anthony, but I understand what they were doing here, because if you're looking at the sheer number of points scored, I mean, those guys have more.
So let me ask you about that. Blake Griffin, Carmelo Anthony, I don't have a problem with them necessarily being on one of the 3 teams. I just don't know if second team was where I would have slotted those 2 guys. Jonathan, let's start with you. What are your thoughts? I mean, we know Carmelo, but your thoughts on Blake?
I wouldn't have him second team. I would definitely have Nowitzki over him. And I think, even Giannis has a strong case there. And like I said, some of those older guys like KG,
right,
like Nash, Klay Thompson, for me, definitely should be a second team
sure,
guy. And so I don't see an argument for Blake Griffin ahead of those guys.
Yeah, he took the words right out of my mouth. I completely agree with that, and I think it's interesting to see just how much that body of work that you were talking about plays into who is considered on what list. Because if you were just looking at the MVP, Giannis would be higher, but we're not. We're looking at a long stretch of time, and so Blake just has a lot on his resume over that period of time.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For highlights and analysis, check out the ESPN app, and for live streaming and premium content, check out ESPN+.